8 golden age stars, ruined by drugs. She passed away on the floor of a rundown apartment, her body discovered only after her dog started feeding on what was left of her. He was found in a deserted building, interred as a John Doe for more than a year. She never reached 40. He passed looking 2 decades older than he actually was. This wasn't a single tragedy. This was the system operating precisely as intended. Behind the glittering facade of Hollywood's golden age hid a ruthless mechanism that didn't merely find stars. It created them, squeezed every drop of value from them, and then discarded them when they broke. The drugs powering this mechanism weren't random mistakes. They were calculated instruments of domination. The pills weren't for fun. They were job requirements, as admitted by a former studio physician who worked through the 1950s. Stimulants to keep them filming through 18-hour days, sedatives to put them under between takes. When addiction inevitably took hold, the studios feigned surprise, as if they hadn't engineered those dependencies from the start. The cycle was mercilessly effective. Elevate stars to impossible heights, dose them to sustain inhuman workloads, drop them the moment addiction made them undependable, then act as though it was all their own weakness. What makes these stories truly revolting isn't simply the ruined lives. It's how the same industry that handed a 13-year-old girl her first stimulants would later blacklist her for the addiction it had manufactured. How the same bosses who kept doctors on staff to hand out pills would publicly scold their stars for losing control. Hollywood supplied the drugs, then punished them when the drugs did exactly what they were meant to do. Today, we're uncovering the 8 most heartbreaking drug-related tragedies from Hollywood's so-called golden age. Studio-orchestrated addictions, careers burned to ash, bodies found far too late. This isn't mere celebrity gossip. It's proof of an industry founded on the deliberate demolition of the very people who built its fortune. But let's begin with the most devastating case of all. The child star who went from Disney's cherished golden boy to dying alone on a stained mattress, his body unclaimed, his name erased by the industry that once idolized him. Bobby Driscoll, Disney's disposable child. When Walt Disney needed the ideal all-American kid to anchor his early live-action films, he picked Bobby Driscoll. With his bright eyes and genuine gift, Driscoll became Disney's first signed child actor, the wholesome face of family entertainment and the voice of Peter Pan. Then he hit puberty, and Disney tossed him aside like trash. They didn't simply let him go when his features matured, a Disney historian explained anonymously. They blacklisted him, warned other studios he was trouble. The same company that had forced 60-hour weeks on him as a child ensured no one else would hire him. The emotional damage was instant. Picture being America's most adored child one moment, then suddenly worthless the next. Driscoll, completely unprepared for this brutal rejection, faced torment at public school from peers envious of his past glory. His once charming face was changing, his self-assurance crushed. By 17, he was numbing the pain with anything available, alcohol first, then heroin. "Disney taught me drugs," he told a friend shortly before he died. "The studio gave me pills to stay alert, pills to sleep. I was taking them before I even understood addiction." Let that sink in. The company synonymous with pure childhood introduced Driscoll to drugs as work tools while he was still a little boy. By his early 20s, his spiral was unstoppable. Arrests for possession, failed comeback attempts, frantic efforts to escape the label of unwanted former child star. In 1968, kids playing in an abandoned East Village tenement in New York stumbled upon a horrific sight. A body on a cot, surrounded by religious leaflets and empty beer bottles. With no ID and a face no longer resembling his famous childhood self, the man was buried as a John Doe in a pauper's grave on Hart Island. It took almost a year for fingerprints to identify him as Hollywood's one-time golden child. He was Disney's golden boy. Then he died alone, penniless and forgotten, his biographer summed up. The cruelest part, the boy who played Peter Pan, the child who never grew up on screen, died so young yet looked unrecognizable from years of hardship. Driscoll was only 31. The studio that once plastered his image on lunchboxes and comics never publicly acknowledged his death. Judy Garland, MGM's chemical victim. The most appalling part of Judy Garland's story isn't that she died from a barbiturate overdose. It's that her first pills were forced upon her by studio bosses when she was just 13. MGM didn't merely recommend amphetamines. They had studio doctors give them to her while her mother looked on, according to a former MGM staff member who saw it happen. They called them pep pills and told the teenager they were vitamins. When hunger struck, they handed her suppressants. When she couldn't sleep from all the stimulants, they gave her downers. This wasn't occasional. It was routine chemical control of a child's body to keep The Wizard of Oz and later films on schedule. By 16, Garland was completely hooked on the up and down cycle, a dependency she never chose and barely understood at first. Studio chief Louis B. Mayer and his handlers controlled her doses, tracked her weight, and managed every part of her growing body with drugs. They gave her pills to wake, pills to sleep, pills to eat less, pills to eat at all, her biographer wrote. Then they dared to scold her for lacking discipline when she couldn't perform without the chemicals they had addicted her to. The most heartbreaking line on her death certificate, under occupation, it lists singer and actress, as if her real job hadn't been survivor of studio drug control. When MGM finally fired her in 1950 after 15 years of chemical manipulation, they offered no treatment, no admission of responsibility. They branded her difficult and unreliable, industry terms for an addict they had created but no longer wished to handle. Hollywood gave her the drugs, then blamed her when they worked perfectly, an addiction expert who studied her case observed. She wasn't a warning about star excess. She was a purposefully created addict who never agreed to the dependency that finally killed her. She died alone in a rented London bathroom, found by her fifth husband. She was 47 but appeared 67. Her body aged far beyond its years by the chemical war that started when she was still a girl. Every studio executive who first placed pills in her teenage hands outlived her. Gail Russell, Paramount's frightened beauty. Some stars used drugs for pleasure. Gail Russell drank to survive because it was the only way she could face the cameras that paralyzed her with fear. Paramount spotted a stunning face and shoved her in front of lenses without any acting lessons, a film historian specializing in Golden Age actresses explained. She was painfully shy, shaking with stage fright so bad she would throw up before takes. Instead of easing her in slowly, they told her to drink. This wasn't gentle suggestion. Her terror was so obvious that directors and crew openly passed her alcohol before tough scenes. The studio had no time for therapy. Booze was quicker, cheaper, and got the day's filming done. Just take the edge off, they told the petrified young woman. A couple of drinks to settle the nerves. Those couple of drinks turned into a crippling addiction that changed one of Hollywood's most delicate beauties into a swollen, unsteady shadow in just a few years. The drinking that started as studio-approved coping became full alcoholism that made her unhireable. The most crushing detail, Russell never even wanted to act. Paramount scouts found her in art school, chasing her true love of painting. The system grabbed her extraordinary looks, forced her into a career that fed her worst fears, then treated those fears with the substance that would destroy her. She drank to endure, and it killed her quicker than stardom, said a director who worked with her in her prime. The studio gave an untrained, deeply anxious girl the impossible choice: drink or fail. When the drinking finally made her useless to them, they dropped her without remorse. Russell died alone in her apartment in 1961, surrounded by empty bottles. She was 36 but looked far older, her famed beauty wrecked by the very thing they'd urged her to use to sell it. Her body wasn't found for days. The bitterest twist, her death certificate cited alcohol effects, with no mention of the industry that first pushed the bottle into her hand. Montgomery Clift, beauty broken, pain unleashed. The car smashed into a telephone pole on a twisting California road in 1956. Inside was Montgomery Clift, the actor many saw as Marlon Brando's only equal, the sensitive leading man whose depth and stunning looks had reshaped screen masculinity. He survived the wreck, but the Montgomery Clift who came out of reconstructive surgery was essentially a different man. His face forever changed, his soul shattered, and his dependence on painkillers about to ruin everything he'd achieved. After the crash, he wasn't only in physical agony, a close friend who watched his fall recalled. He was in existential torment. Half his identity had been tied to being the most handsome man in film. Now the mirror showed someone else, and the pain never ended. What came next was a medical nightmare now known as iatrogenic addiction, doctor-induced dependence through overprescribing. Different doctors wrote overlapping painkiller scripts. No one tracked the dangerous mixes or rising doses. Clift, desperate for relief from both body and mind, followed medical advice while mixing in alcohol to make the cocktail deadlier. He took what they prescribed, then more when it stopped helping, his biographer said. His medicine cabinets looked like drugstore stock. Bottles everywhere, many from doctors who never spoke to each other. The change was terrifyingly quick. Within 3 years of the accident, the once reliable, meticulous actor struggled to recall lines. His hands trembled, his speech sometimes slurred. Insurance companies started demanding extra bonds for any film with him, an added expense that made studios wary despite his brilliance. Friends watched helplessly as the gifted performer vanished into a haze of drugs and drink. Directors who knew his genius devised complex workarounds, filming his scenes first thing in the morning, using doubles for long shots, cutting around his worst days. He was still brilliant, but pain and pills swallowed everything, a late career director noted. The tragedy wasn't only that the crash altered his face, it was that the medical response to the crash destroyed his mind. On July 23, 1966, Clift's nurse found him dead in his New York bedroom. The official cause was heart attack, but the true cause was a decade of pharmaceutical damage to his body. A fatal mix of alcohol and prescription drugs had slowly wrecked his heart. He was 45. More than 30 legally prescribed bottles were found in his home. Bela Lugosi, Dracula's real-life horror. The cruelest irony of Bela Lugosi's life is that the man who played eternal life on screen was ruined by trying to manage very human pain. Everyone remembers him as Dracula, but few discuss why he became addicted to morphine, a horror film historian said. It wasn't for kicks. Lugosi suffered chronic sciatic pain from years of demanding physical roles. In the 1930s, opiates were the only real relief. Legitimate treatment turned into dependence as his tolerance grew. Lugosi's rising need for pain relief coincided with his career fading. His accent and typecasting as Dracula restricted roles as horror moved past the style he defined. Professional frustration added mental stress that deepened his reliance. The less work he got, the more he fixated on pain. The more drugs he needed, the less hireable he became, a vicious cycle fueled by medication. By the late 1940s, his opiate addiction visibly affected his looks and dependability. The commanding presence of his early years gave way to a thin, sometimes confused figure. Major studios stopped calling. His desperate final roles, appearing in notoriously awful Ed Wood movies for a few $100s, weren't the choice of a man with options. They were the last hope of an addict taking any job that might fund his next dose. He played the undead and ended up living like one, a substance abuse expert observed. Lugosi's story shows how fast proper medical use can become devastating addiction when pain, declining work, and tolerance collide. In 1955, he bravely did something rare for the time. Publicly admitted his addiction and entered treatment, hoping to recover and reduce stigma. Rehab methods then were crude. He had periods of sobriety, but his chronic pain went untreated. Without better options, relapse was nearly certain. He died in 1956 at 73, broke despite creating one of film's most enduring icons. The contrast between his cultural impact and personal ruin couldn't be starker. In a final indignity that mirrored his career arc, Lugosi was buried in one of his Dracula capes, forever tying him to the role that made him famous, yet helped trap him as pain and addiction grew worse. The doctors who prescribed his drugs for decades without proper oversight or alternatives didn't attend his funeral or learn from his case. Barbara Payton. Hollywood's swiftest plunge. No Hollywood fall matches Barbara Payton's for pure speed. In 5 years, she went from Warner Brothers contract player to streetwalker, a collapse so fast it's almost unbelievable. One of Hollywood's quickest and most savage drops, her biographer John O'Dowd noted. Drugs and alcohol didn't just kill her career, they wiped out her entire existence. Payton's big break came in 1950, with Kiss Tomorrow Goodbye opposite James Cagney, a part that hinted at real promise. With platinum hair and a curvaceous figure, she perfectly fit what studios sold in the early 1950s. Her downfall started with a scandalous love triangle involving actors Francho Tone and Tom Neal that exploded in the tabloids when Neal beat Tone badly enough to hospitalize him. The scandal hurt both men, but it destroyed Payton, highlighting Hollywood's double standard for women. A female star linked to violence, even indirectly, became untouchable. This rejection sped up her existing substance issues. As real acting jobs vanished, she turned to alcohol, barbiturates, and eventually heroin. Not just to party, but to dull the despair of her crumbling life. She used it all. Pills, liquor, finally heroin. A friend from that time recalled. She wasn't celebrating. She was self-medicating unbearable pain with anything available. Her physical decline was shockingly rapid. Pictures from 1951 show a glamorous blonde bombshell. By 1956, she looked 20 years older, swollen, unkempt, her once flawless face ruined by abuse and hardship. As addiction worsened, money ran out. With no safety net and an industry that had abandoned her completely, Payton made the unthinkable leap, from studio star to Sunset Strip prostitute in under 10 years. She was selling herself on streets where her films had played just years earlier, her biographer said. Sometimes clients recognized her from movies, moments that humiliated her further and drove her deeper into drugs to escape the shame. The geometry of her destruction was flawless. Substances made her unhireable. No work created desperation. Desperation led to prostitution. The trauma of prostitution deepened her addiction. Each part fed the next in a perfect cycle of ruin. Payton died in 1967 at 39. Her body ravaged by years of abuse, liver failure, heart disease, malnutrition. The autopsy showed organs of someone far older. Her New York Times obituary was 2 sentences. Errol Flynn, the swashbuckler who poisoned himself. Errol Flynn didn't just portray adventure, he injected it straight into his bloodstream. Alcohol, opiates, cocaine, barbiturates. A film historian listed his drugs of choice, often mixed in the same day, sometimes in the same glass. His body was a war zone where substances battled while his organs took the damage. What set Flynn apart wasn't just the range of his intake, but how it clashed with his screen image. As Robin Hood and Captain Blood, he embodied vigor and athletic grace. Off-screen, he was steadily wrecking the body that made him a star. He didn't pick favorites, his biographer said. Stimulants to start the day, alcohol all day, cocaine for bursts, heroin or downers to crash. His daily dose would kill most people, but his tolerance was epic until it collapsed. Flynn's looks tracked his decline. The dashing hero of the 1930s became the puffy, shaky figure of the 1950s. His lean frame softened, his famous face bloated. His stamina gone to the point that doubles did most action in later films. By his 40s, he could barely climb stairs without gasping, a late director recalled. His hands shook so much that close-ups of him holding props used stand-in hands. This was the man who once did his own stunts and duels. The career fallout was inevitable. Insurers demanded extra coverage for his films. Directors planned around his state, shooting him early, using doubles, keeping him seated. Tragically, Flynn's heavy living became part of his brand. The wild adventurer whose real exploits matched his roles. That image made help impossible. How do you treat a drinking problem that's central to your fame? Flynn died in Vancouver in 1959, supposedly selling his yacht to pay debts. Official cause, heart attack and circulatory collapse. Real cause, 20 years of relentless chemical attack on his heart and vessels. He was 50. The coroner famously said Flynn had the body of a 70-year-old, every major organ scarred by decades of abuse. He lived hard and died young, his biographer said. The same habits that once fueled his legend eventually erased it, leaving another lesson Hollywood ignores. Flynn's self-poisoning set the pattern countless later stars would repeat. The hard-partying icon whose excesses first create buzz, then destroy the very appeal that sold tickets. John Drew Barrymore, A Dynasty of Ruin. The most haunting part of John Drew Barrymore's addiction isn't that it ended his own promising career. It's that it formed the middle act in a three-generation story of genius and self-destruction that would later threaten his daughter, Drew. The Barrymore name didn't protect him. It crushed him, a historian of Hollywood families observed. John Drew inherited not only his father's immense talent, but also his weakness for addiction. Genes plus the pressure of living under legendary yet tragic shadows. His father, the great John Barrymore, had been one of America's finest actors before booze ruined his career and life. John Drew showed real early promise, hinting he might continue the family's artistic legacy without repeating its downfall. That hope died as drugs took over. What started with alcohol, perhaps genetic and learned from watching his father's era, grew to include LSD, amphetamines, and anything else 1960s Hollywood offered. Career wrecked by LSD, speed, and booze, a 1960s colleague said. He wasn't experimenting, he was consuming massive amounts. He'd vanish for days, return with no recall of where he'd been. The fallout was swift and total. Missed calls, forgotten lines, unpredictable behavior. Major studios lost interest despite the famous name. Arrested, blacklisted, eventually near homeless, his biographer wrote. By the late 1960s, no respectable project would touch him. His actions grew so erratic, even old friends pulled away, fearing he'd steal to feed his habit. His final decades were marked by isolation and money troubles. Never fully homeless for long, he still bounced between friends' couches and cheap motels while battling ongoing addiction. His contact with daughter Drew, born in 1975, was rare and strained. She barely knew him growing up, and later faced her own widely reported child star substance battles, starting drugs at 9, rehab by 13. When I was born, my dad was already gone, Drew later said. Not just away, chemically gone. The few times I saw him, he wasn't present. He was whatever he was on. John Drew Barrymore died in 2004 at 72. Long cut off from the industry that once embraced him as royalty, his passing got little notice. Far from the headlines his father's death earned decades earlier. His legacy is mainly as the bridge in a chain of addiction from grandfather to father to daughter. 3 generations of Barrymores, 3 generations of substance struggle, an expert on the family noted. It's one of the clearest public examples of addiction's hereditary side, each fighting the same unseen biological enemy, usually without knowing it. The machine still runs. The stories of these shattered stars, Judy Garland, Bobby Driscoll, Gail Russell, Montgomery Clift, Bela Lugosi, Barbara Payton, Errol Flynn, and John Drew Barrymore, aren't just old tragedies. They're proof of a system that still operates today with only cosmetic changes. The drugs have changed, but the pattern is eerily familiar. An addiction expert who has treated stars across eras observed. Studios no longer hand out pills directly, but the demands, impossible hours, perfect looks, constant availability, still push people toward dependency. What links these cases is exploitation that turns human weakness into profit until that weakness stops paying. Child stars like Garland and Driscoll were openly given uppers and downers as work tools, their young brains forever changed by studio-required drugs. Adults like Russell and Clift got substances to solve job problems, stage fright, post-accident pain. They weren't ruined by drugs alone, an industry historian stressed. They were ruined by a system that introduced the drugs, made them seem essential for the job, then abandoned them when addiction became a liability. The special cruelty is how the system frames addiction as personal failure instead of predictable result of its own practices. Studios that gave pep pills to kids later acted shocked when those kids couldn't work without stimulants as adults. Producers who urged actresses to drink before tough scenes later called them unreliable when drinking became constant. Hollywood is masterful at rewriting its own history, the historian said. These weren't random misfortunes or tales of overindulgence. They were the system doing exactly what it was built to do: squeeze maximum profit from talent, use chemicals to push human limits further, then throw away the wreckage while taking zero blame. These Golden Age cases are especially useful because they spotlight today's practices. While studios don't dispense drugs anymore, the pressure to use something, anything, to meet insane demands remains. From Judy Garland to Heath Ledger, the cycle repeats with heartbreaking consistency, the expert concluded. The industry creates impossible expectations, openly or subtly encourages chemical shortcuts to meet them, then acts surprised and saddened when addiction follows. Until the root conditions change, these stories will keep piling up, no matter how many warnings history offers. These Golden Age victims weren't destroyed by drugs. They were destroyed by an industry that saw talent as disposable, health as unimportant, and people as resources to exploit until they were spent, then discard when the value was gone. The pills weren't the sickness. They were just symptoms of a machine that keeps grinding lives to dust today. One prescription, one collapse, one overdose at a time.